Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. We have a lot to talk about this week. The continued dominance of the Taylor Swift Eras Tour at the box office and the opening weekend of Martin Scorsese's latest film, Killers of the Flower Moon. The discussion around that performance and how we talk about the box office with that movie. Is it different than how we talk about the box office with other movies? We'll get into all of that. And let's jump in with the top 10 for this past weekend. At number 1 is Taylor Swift, The Eras Tour, which took a 64.2% drop, which we didn't really know what to expect there. It is a big event movie. How front-loaded was it going to be? Some people were saying 70% or more of a drop. A 64.2% drop is on par with some big blockbusters, so we're kind of in uncharted territory here. I don't think that that's a terrible drop, honestly, for something that was hyped very much as an opening day and opening weekend event. The domestic total for the Eras Tour right now is just under $132 million after that $33.2 million second weekend. In second place is Killers of the Flower Moon, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Robert De Niro, and Lily Gladstone. A $23.2 million opening weekend for a movie with a budget reported around $200 million. I have a lot to say about that. The Exorcist Believers in third place, a 48.3% drop in week 3 for a $5.6 million total, and a domestic total right now around $54.3 million. Again, the movie isn't overly impressive, but it's not absolutely bottoming out like me and many others thought that it might. In fourth place is Paw Patrol, the Mighty Movie, in week 4 with a 35.8% drop from last week and a $4.4 million total. It's now over $56 million domestically. In fifth place last week was Hocus Pocus. This week, another Disney re-release. It's The Nightmare Before Christmas, which was re-released for its 30th anniversary. It brings in almost $4.3 million for a top 5 finish. Saw X in its fourth week dropped 36.5% for a $3.6 million total. Its domestic total right now around $47.2 million. The Creator continues to languish in box office disappointment land, a 38.1% drop in its fourth week for a $2.6 million total, and a domestic total around $36.8 million. In eighth place is the film Leo, Bloody Sweet, which brought in $2.139 million over the weekend. It opened earlier, though, in the week, so its domestic total is at $4.6 million. This is a Tamil language film from India. It's an adaptation of David Cronenberg's A History of Violence, and it's one of the better openings we've seen from an Indian film this year. It's been a very strong year for Indian films at the box office, worldwide and domestic. In ninth place is A Haunting in Venice. In its sixth week, a 41.3% drop and a $1.1 million total. Its domestic total is now over $40 million. And sticking around in its fourth week is The Blind, which made just over $1 million. Its total right now is at $15.6 million, and it actually set a record that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Dropping out of the top 10 this week, we had 3 movies: The Equalizer 3 after 7 weeks, The Nun 2 after 6 weeks, and Dumb Money after 4 weeks, all exiting those top 10 films in favor of the new releases. And looking at the movies that lost the most theaters, Dumb Money actually leads that pack. It lost about half of its remaining theaters, 1,109 of them, 1,167 theaters remain. The Nun 2 dropped 764 theaters. It remains in 1,364. A Haunting in Venice only dropped 690, and it is in 1,600 theaters. It's actually in wider release now than The Nun 2 and Dumb Money, and that might seem a little weird. Why isn't A Haunting in Venice dropping more theaters? Because The Nun 2 certainly is a bigger movie, but I think there's a few reasons for that. Number one, The Nun 2 is on a shorter release schedule. It's going to be available on Max in a few short days before Halloween. It's been available on PVOD. That's not necessarily the case with A Haunting in Venice, and it's a movie that's geared toward an older audience. And remember, theaters largely, after their contractual window, decide which movies they want to keep around. And I have a hunch that A Haunting in Venice is one of those movies that's able to draw people in, not just on the weekend, but during the week, because a lot of older theater goers are slower to go out and see a movie. It's not putting up great numbers, but I think this slow drop in theater count, when so many other movies that have released around it are dropping theaters more quickly, may have to do with some theaters that are saying, you know what, we're going to keep A Haunting in Venice around for a screening or two during the week and maybe a few screenings on the weekend, because it's still drawing a smattering of people. Expendables 4 dropped 676 theaters. It's now out of wide release and only playing in 407 theaters. And then The Creator loses the 5th most theaters of the last weekend. 470 theaters gone. It's now in 2,490 theaters. This is something we haven't talked about in a while because there haven't been a whole lot of closures lately, but 3 movies actually ended their domestic box office run, meaning that they did not report grosses this past weekend, whereas they did report grosses the previous weekend. That's when I consider the box office run to be done. And believe it or not, Sound of Freedom is just now closing after a 15-week run. It opened back on July 4th. It is now officially out of theaters domestically. Bottoms is also officially closed after 8 weeks in release. 2 of those were in limited release. It played fantastically in 10 theaters that first weekend, but it could never really get that spark to become a breakout hit. I think it's a good example of a movie that played great at festivals and large cities, but not so much nationwide. Didn't really have time to find an audience either. It was in over 1,000 theaters for just 2 weeks. I think it'll eventually make money, but probably less at the box office than was hoped for. And then after 4 weeks, It Lives Inside is also closing. Really, this was just a DOA film as far as theatrical. It opened in 7th place on 2,000 screens, lost 1,800 of them by its 3rd weekend. I think, honestly, this is a theatrical release to raise awareness for streaming. But since the run is now over, let's kind of tie a bow on Sound of Freedom and its 15-week run. Of course, it was the phenomenally successful surprise hit of the summer. And looking at some rough box office stats again, the estimated theatrical profit, this is my estimate, this isn't an official number, but it's made $184 million domestically, $54.3 million internationally, for a worldwide gross of $238.4 million. And the movie still has some international markets remaining, 7 that I could find on the books. It spent 15 weeks in domestic release. The budget for the movie was reportedly around $15 million. Angel Studios raised $5 million in crowdfunding for the marketing and then paid those investors back already, but this was very much a word of mouth hit. And then of course the pay it forward phenomenon. And it should be noted that the grosses that I'm listing here, and when I look at the profit, I'm estimating it made around $100 million in theatrical profit. That's just based off of actual ticket sales. That gross does not count what I calculated to be potentially tens of millions of dollars in money that's left over in tickets that people paid for but weren't claimed. A lot of people seem to think still that the whole pay it forward thing, that when people bought one of those pay it forward tickets that it automatically went toward the box office gross. That's not the case. I've researched this. I've talked to people at Angel Studios about this. That pay it forward is only reflected in the box office gross when those tickets are actually claimed, but that money is essentially off the books as far as the box office goes, as far as tickets that were not claimed. And so Angel Studios, I think, probably stood to make $200+ million off of this movie. So just a phenomenally successful movie for them financially, a controversial movie, certainly one of the biggest talking points of the summer, now officially closing its box office time here domestically. When we look at the road to recovery, that red line there is the box office weekend average for 2021 and 2022 after theaters reopened. The blue line is the box office weekend average for the years 2015 through 2019 pre-pandemic. And then the dotted black line is the total box office gross for each weekend this year. And we're having a topsy-turvy run here. It's really Taylor Swift. We were down, then we were back up. Now we're back down below where we were both pre-COVID and also since theaters reopened. The highest grossing movie on this weekend for the past couple years was the opening of Black Adam last year. The highest grossing movie for 2015 through 2019 was the 2018 reboot of Halloween, which, believe it or not, opened 5 years ago this past weekend. And really imagine what that dotted black line would look like if Taylor Swift had not released her movie. We would be in the absolute dumps. I mean, we would be so far below either of those average lines. And really the whole fall season, we have that big peak with Barbie and Oppenheimer. And then since the box office returns have started to decline on those movies, now that movies have been cleared off the deck for fall, we're not looking great. And we are starting to lose movies for the summer now. Deadpool 3 has been moved off of its summer date. The next Mission Impossible movie has now been moved off of its summer date because the strike, the actor strike, I should say, is continuing. It has not been resolved. Movies can't shoot. And so we have lost a huge part of the fall movie season. We are now looking at the potential crumbling of the summer movie season, which I think would be be absolutely devastating to Hollywood, to the exhibition industry. If we were to lose a significant part of the summer 2024 movie season to the actors' strike, I mean, yeah, the movies will come out eventually, but what's going to be left? What's going to be left when those movies actually do come out? How many theater chains are still going to be able to stay open? I know that there's a lot of people saying the same thing during COVID, but you can only keep limping along for so long until you have to throw in the towel. So I think it is imperative, and it is good news that apparently the actors and the producers, or the AMPTP, are back at the negotiating table today. It is absolutely imperative that this strike is settled equitably and fairly as soon as possible, because the damage that is being done to the industry was already catastrophic before any of these strikes happened. It is now getting more catastrophic almost by the day. Let's turn our attention now outside of the domestic box office to the international box office. And the number one movie was actually not Killers of the Flower Moon. It was Leo Bloody Sweet, which was actually a huge hit in India, reportedly a $29.1 million gross in countries outside of the United States and Canada. This movie stars Indian superstar Vijay. ComScore has its worldwide gross nearing $50 million already. So a big hit out of the Indian market. Killers of the Flower Moon's at $21 million internationally. Trolls Band Together, which doesn't open here in the United States and Canada for several more weeks, it's actually about a month away, is getting a jump start in other countries. So it made $14.3 million. So you know what, other countries, yes, you may get months or weeks delayed on big movies and big blockbusters and things like that, the big art house films and the big Oscar movies. But hey, you got to see Trolls 3 before us. So really, who's coming out on top? In fourth place is the Chinese film Only the River Flows, which is a crime movie about murders by a river. Well, that's appropriate. Set in the 1990s, $12.4 million there. And in fifth place is Paw Patrol, the Mighty Movie, with $11.7 million. When you take the domestic grosses and the international grosses and you combine them together, you get the top 5 films worldwide for this past weekend. In first place was Killers of the Flower Moon with $44.2 million, squeaking out a win by about $500,000 over Taylor Swift The Eras Tour. It brought in $43.7 million, a 65% drop from last weekend, so the drop domestically and worldwide is about the same. Leo Bloody Sweet brings in $31.2 million. Paw Patrol, the Mighty Movie, has a good hold. It dropped just 48.6% from last weekend for $16.1 million worldwide, and Trolls Band Together rounds out the top 5 with $14.3 million, all collected in international markets. So let's talk about some of the movies that were in the domestic top 10, and we'll actually skip ahead to the number 2 movie this past weekend, although I have several things to talk about with Taylor Swift. But let's talk about Killers of the Flower Moon and Martin Scorsese. At the end of last week's show, we looked at what his top 5 openings of all time at the box office were, or at least the openings that we have data for. And let's look at the updated numbers here, and Leo really has brought Scorsese to box office heights that are unmatched, because now the top 4 box office debuts in Martin Scorsese's career star Leonardo DiCaprio. Shutter Island remains on top with $41 million back in 2010. The Departed in 2006 is in second place at $26.8 million. Then we have Killers of the Flower Moon at $23.2 million. The Wolf of Wall Street in fourth place now at $18.4 million, although it should be noted that it opened on a Wednesday, so that quote-unquote opening weekend gross does not contain the first 2 days of box office grosses for the film. And in fifth place, also opening on a Wednesday, is Hugo with $11.3 million back in 2011. And of course, you know what we do here on the show. Well, what would happen if you adjust for inflation? And the answer is, well, not a whole lot as far as which movies are there in the top 5, just a couple of order changes. Shutter Island remains number 1 with a $57.9 million adjusted opening, followed by The Departed at $41 million back in 2006. Although when you do adjust for inflation, The Wolf of Wall Street moves into third place at $24.3 million. Killers of the Flower Moon is in fourth place at $23.2 million. And then number 5 belongs to Robert De Niro, who also co-stars in Killers of the Flower Moon, and Cape Fear back in 1991. It brought in $23.1 million adjusted on its opening weekend back in November of 1991. So when you look at Martin Scorsese's career, Killers of the Flower Moon is a top 5 opening, no matter how you cut it. But Scorsese is working at a scale with this movie that he has really only been doing in recent years, because the movie reportedly carried a $200 million budget. And when you consider that, then the $23 million opening isn't quite as impressive. To break even with a $200 million budget, traditionally, you have to get to at least $450 to $500 million worldwide. Killers of the Flower Moon right now is at about $44 million worldwide, so we're not even close. And to keep things, or to put things in perspective, Elemental had a budget almost exactly, or exactly reportedly, where Killers of the Flower Moon was. It was at about $200 million. It actually opened a little bit higher than Killers of the Flower Moon. And we were here on this channel and on many other channels screaming our heads off about the fact that this is one of the most catastrophic debuts of all time. Now, luckily for Elemental, it had staying power and was able to really recover nicely from that opening weekend. But as far as that opening number goes, I mean, that was a 5-alarm fire when we were talking about the box office. And yet I've seen a bit of a muted discussion when it comes to Killers of the Flower Moon and its opening weekend. And part of it, yes, is because this was a movie that was financed by Apple. And many people say, well, you know, Apple financed the film. They weren't really financing the movie to make money theatrically, but it would be nice if the movie did make money. And it's not really going to, unless it has a phenomenal run like Elemental did in the theatrical window. I know that the economics behind streaming are different, but this is a box office show, and this is a movie that opened in wide release and in worldwide release. And so I'm going to analyze the numbers as far as the box office goes. And box office wise, this was a pretty bad opening for a $200 million movie. If this were a Marvel movie that opened to this number, people would be losing their minds. Now, to be fair, Apple is getting way more for their investment than Netflix did with The Irishman. They didn't really put The Irishman in many theaters at all. It made a token box office gross, and they took on all of that cost, again, to be associated with Scorsese. And hey, listen, they got Oscar nominations out of it. It's a prestige movie. I'm sure it generated some watch time on their service, but I kind of suspect that this is going to be one of the last times we see one of these obscenely expensive movies that a streaming service just shells out money for in order to be associated with the filmmaker. The economics of streaming have always been questionable. I think the purse strings are going to get drawn a little bit tighter, and I don't know how many more times a director, even a director as great as Martin Scorsese, is going to get essentially a blank check to make a movie as expensive as he possibly wants to make. Now, there are some other people that point out, and somewhat correctly, that the budget looks higher because things like back end and residuals, getting paid for how well a movie does at the box office, is included up front, that the stars are basically paid more at the beginning and it's reflected in the salary because the movie's going to streaming, and they're not going to have those profit participations like you would with a purely theatrical film. But also, it is getting a theatrical release, and more than just a limited release for a week or two. It seems to be getting a full windowed theatrical release. So I wonder just how much of that profit participation is actually built in to the upfront budget of the movie, and how much of it is actually based on how much it makes at the box office. But putting all those caveats aside, well, streaming this, Apple that, let's just look at the movie itself, because we actually have a test case this year for a 3+ hour historical drama, R-rated, and how an audience can optimally respond to that. And that, of course, is Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer had many of the same drawbacks that people give Killers of the Flower Moon, and yet Killers of the Flower Moon opened to just over a quarter of what Oppenheimer did. And yes, Killers of the Flower Moon didn't have a Barbie. There was no Barbenheimer type phenomenon that was surrounding it. But at the same time, I don't think that could really account for the difference in box office if audiences were as interested, or if they were responding to the movie in the same manner. Keep in mind that Oppenheimer cost half as much as Killers of the Flower Moon, but opened almost to 4 times the box office. Part of it, I'm sure that, or at least something that didn't help, was that these stars couldn't promote the film because the actors are still on strike. So you don't have De Niro and DiCaprio out there doing interviews. Martin Scorsese was doing the best that he could, but that is something that Oppenheimer didn't really have to deal with. The strike started right after the movie basically finished its publicity rounds. But I don't want to treat Killers of the Flower Moon with kid gloves just because I liked the movie, which I did quite enjoy the movie, or because it's Martin Scorsese. I absolutely respect Martin Scorsese. I think he's one of the greatest filmmakers to to ever live. I think the performances in this movie are great. There's some of my favorite actors. I think that Lily Gladstone deserves awards consideration. I think that it's an important story to be told, even if I didn't quite agree with exactly how it was told in every aspect. But at the same time, I can't just make excuses for it because I like it. And yes, the economics on it are a little bit different perhaps than your standard movie, but Apple and Paramount chose to open Killers of the Flower Moon in a very traditional theatrical rollout. And so, yeah, I'm going to judge its performance based off of that, which is to say that it is disappointing when you look at it financially that Killers of the Flower Moon was not able to get much more of an audience than it did. I'm not saying it could open to $80 million like Oppenheimer, but you would think with Scorsese and De Niro and DiCaprio involved that you could maybe draw a $50 million opening. I think that people were turned off by the length. I think that the length was tied into the discussion of the movie in a way that it wasn't with Oppenheimer. I think that the history that was being told is less well known, and the story that you have to sell the audience on is much more difficult. And so the audience interest is going to be harder to generate. And I also think that maybe people just weren't interested in this story. I think that they would be if they gave the movie a chance, but I think it's just a harder sell. The hope here is that Killers of the Flower Moon is able to do something like what The Wolf of Wall Street did, which again opens to, we just saw, not a spectacular opening weekend number. It ended up at over $115 million domestically, but the international market is what really helped it. It made over $400 million worldwide. It made 70% of its money in international markets. I don't know if we're going to see that same kind of performance here. Wolf of Wall Street was also in the holiday market. That is not the market that we're in today, and the marketplace has changed radically. So if I were to look at this performance and project forward, I would say that it is very likely that Killers of the Flower Moon is going to lose tens of millions of dollars theatrically by any actual theatrical standard or box office standard. Looking at it by any traditional box office metric, I would say that the movie is a disappointment bordering on a flop, depending on how it does in the weeks ahead. But who knows? It could rally at the box office. It could stick around throughout this fall movie season and awards season and be able to overcome this weekend like we saw with Elemental. I don't want to make too many final proclamations here now, and we'll continue to track the movie over the weeks ahead. But yeah, the discussion around this film has been very interesting. I think that people want to sort of give it a break, and I understand that. But, to a certain extent, numbers are numbers. And after week one of Killers of the Flower Moon, this is where we are. All right, so I mentioned I also wanted to look at some numbers for Taylor Swift, the Eras Tour. Of course, last week, the opening weekend was enough for it to become the highest grossing concert/live musical performance film of all time. It's now almost doubled the previous record, which was held by Justin Bieber, Never Say Never. But I wanted to look at it in a more historical context, not just against concert films, but against live performance movies, and also to adjust the box office grosses for inflation. So this is a chart that lists not just concert movies, but any sort of live performance, stand-up comedy, you name it. And the number one movie, as noted last week, is actually Woodstock, the documentary film, which is also a concert film that came out back in 1970. According to the box office records that I could find, if you adjusted its gross for inflation, the minimum number, and I found a documented record of around $35 million. Some people claim it's $50 million, but that $35 million that I could find a hard number for translates to $273.7 million when you adjust that for inflation. So that's number one. In second place right now is Eddie Murphy Raw, back in 1987, a stand-up comedy film, a theatrical release that made an adjusted total of $136.8 million. That's how big Eddie Murphy was in his prime as a comedian. Taylor Swift, the Eras Tour is actually right behind at $131.9 million. Then we have Richard Pryor, Live on the Sunset Strip, back in 1982. That movie made $115.7 million. Again, Richard Pryor at his peak. And then Michael Jackson's This Is It, back in 2009, with an adjusted domestic total of $103.4 million. But let's widen that scope even more to non-narrative films. So films that are not written. Now, I'm not talking about things like Borat, which is kind of a hybrid movie. Yes, some of it's reality, but there's also a scripted element. This is stuff that is totally unscripted or reality or whatever you want to call it. And Woodstock is still number one here at $273.7 million. In second place, and again, these are domestic numbers adjusted for inflation is Michael Moore's incendiary documentary, Fahrenheit 9/11, which came out back in June of 2004, $194.2 million domestically adjusted for inflation. And of course, its kinship film, really a very similar film in many respects, Jackass 3D, back in October of 2010, made $165.4 million adjusted. Then we have Eddie Murphy Raw in fourth place and the Eras Tour in fifth place. So that's really where Taylor Swift measures up. It's not just concert films. It's any sort of film that covers a live performance. It's any sort of film that is non-scripted or non-narrative. The Eras Tour is still doing things that make it one of the higher performing films in this group of movies. And so, I think it's to be commended. Yes, you can bring up the ticket prices. They're more expensive. There are always caveats to bring up. The point is, it is a very successful movie and one that people are still going to see. Looking at some other movies in the top 10, let's look at the updated franchise tracker for Saw. Saw X continues to perform in the marketplace, and it is now the sixth highest grossing film domestically in the Saw franchise history. It is now past 2010's Saw 3D. I don't know if it's going to be hitting the top 5 because it actually had a surprise release on Premium Video on Demand this past weekend. You can already see the movie at home, but still just outside the top 5 for Saw X. Looking at the worldwide box office tracker, it has now passed 2009's Saw 6 to become the 8th highest grossing film in the franchise, although it does not look like it's going to be one of those $100 million grossing Saw movies. So on the lower end as far as the worldwide box office total, but still these movies are made for such a small amount of money that I think that it will still break even, and the producers will probably start looking at Saw 11 at some point in the future. And then a movie that's wrapping up its box office run, The Nun 2, it's at $85.3 million, and that is enough to move it past 2014's Annabelle domestically to become the 5th highest grossing film in franchise history. Again, it's not going to be joining the $100 million grossing films, such as The Conjuring, The Nun, The Conjuring 2, and Annabelle Creation, but also, and once again, the production costs on these movies are so low that it doesn't really matter that it hits those heights. It would be nice, but it's not a deal breaker. And then I mentioned our number 10 movie, which is The Blind, and the fact that it set a record that I didn't even really know was in play, and that involves Fathom Events. If you don't know what Fathom Events is, it is a company that does basically special engagement showings. They'll do one-night-only revivals of movies like Back to the Future, which we'll see on a chart in a few minutes, or they'll do sort of cult films that they'll play for 1 or 2 nights. But they've been moving slowly into the direction of becoming a more traditional distributor, and for one specific type of film, because The Blind just became the highest grossing film in Fathom Events history at $15.3 million, and the other 4 films on this list are all aimed at a faith-based audience. The Chosen Season 3, Episodes 1 and 2 is in second place at $14.6 million. Then Christmas with The Chosen, The Messengers is at $13.3 million. I Heard the Bells is at $5.6 million, and The Chosen Season 3 finale is at $5.5 million. So you see The Chosen taking up 3 of those slots there. It should be noted that The Chosen is produced by Angel Studios, who just had that huge hit with Sound of Freedom, and reportedly the entire 4th season of The Chosen is going to be released through Fathom in theaters. So that could make a huge box office impact as far as their record books. And this has been a very interesting turn for Fathom, because when you go back in time just 2 years, they did not have this sort of faith-based bent in their record books. All 5 of these movies have been released since December 1st, 2021, so just in the past couple years. And when you look at the top 10 grossing Fathom Events, even though they do anime and they do superhero films, things like that, Godzilla movies, the top 10 grossers now only include 3 films that are not aimed at predominantly Christian audiences. Those movies are Jay and Silent Bob Reboot, Clerks 3, and Batman the Killing Joke. The rest are all movies and events aimed at Christian audiences. So Fathom Events has kind of found themselves in a new niche. They are becoming the go-to distributor in many ways for faith-based films, and it's taking their box office to unprecedented heights. So could this be a strange new path for Fathom Events, that you're going to see more and more of them leaning into this direction because they get a cut of these movies too when they distribute them to theaters? We'll just have to see what happens. Let's look at some weekend records, and we'll start with the top 5 per theater averages for the past weekend. Anatomy of a Fall was beaten out by the Eras Tour last weekend, but it takes the crown as far as per theater averages this weekend. It made $10,880 in 14 theaters. I want to see this movie so bad. I hope I get a chance to see it soon. Taylor Swift The Eras Tour is in second place with $8,615 in each of its 3,855 theaters. In third place is a film called The Persian Version. It made $8,399 in 9 theaters. It's from writer-director Mariam Keshavarz, and it won the Audience Award in the dramatic competition at this year's Sundance Film Festival. I actually got a chance to see it. I enjoyed it. It didn't stick in my mind as a great movie, but definitely a good one. In fourth place is a documentary, it sounds horrifying, called Another Body. It's about a woman looking for justice after deep fake pornography of her was posted online. The documentary also uses deep fake technology to disguise the identities of the participants in the doc. It's an interesting, horrifying sounding movie that I would like to check out. Another Body brought in $7,754 in just one theater, and then Killers of the Flower Moon brought in $6,409 in each of its 3,628 theaters. Looking at the top grossers in limited release, so this would be 1,000 theaters or fewer. In first place was Leo Bloody Sweet, which played in 720 theaters and brought in $2.13 million. We talked about Fathom Events. They released Back to the Future on Back to the Future Day, October 21st, for one night only in 988 theaters, and that brought in $739,000. The Met Opera, Dead Man Walking, an operatic adaptation of the film that starred Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn, brought in $472,000 from an unknown number of theaters. Also in the top 10, another film from India, Bhagavant Kesari, in an unknown number of theaters, brings in just over $400,000. And continuing its expansion is A24's Dix the Musical, which brought in $377,000 in 345 theaters. Of course, these movies that we're talking about in limited release are largely found at the independent theaters that are scattered around the country and the world. And each week here on the show, or most weeks, I like to feature one of them. If the movie theaters that I talk about take donations, then 10% of the ad revenue from each one of these episodes will go to that particular theater. And this week we're talking about the Enzian, a theater in Maitland, Florida, near Orlando. It was founded in 1985 and claims the title of Central Florida's only full-time independent theater. Enzian began as a place to show classic movies, but in the late 80s, the theater transitioned to showing first-run independent films. And of all the theaters I've seen and covered on the show, this is one of the most unique looking. It's set amid some luscious greenery outside. It has some large chairs, love seats, sofas, and tables inside so you can enjoy your movie in sort of a casual dining atmosphere. The theater operates under the slogan Film, Food, Friends, and also offers the Eden Bar attached to the building, so you can make a full night out of seeing a movie. This week, you can see A24's Dix the Musical, which we just talked about, as well as 1993's Body Snatchers in celebration of the Halloween season. They will also be presenting their once monthly Popcorn Flicks in the Park in nearby Winter Park, Florida, which is a free movie screening open to the community. This month's movie is Vincent Price's classic House on Haunted Hill. Upcoming features at Enzian include Alexander Payne's The Holdovers, as well as hosting the Central Florida Jewish Film Festival and a cult classic screening of 1990's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Enzian is also a nonprofit that accepts donations, and you can find out more at enzian.org. If you end up making a donation or heading over there to see a movie, please tell them, as always, that Dan sent you. Let's look now at the fall holiday box office chart. This is everything post-Labor Day going through the end of the year. Taylor Swift The Eras Tour remains easily the #1 film of the season at $131.9 million. The Nun 2's in second place at $85.3 million. Paw Patrol's in third place at just over $56 million. The Exorcist Believers in fourth at $54.3 million, followed by Saw X at $47.2 million. A Haunting in Venice in sixth place at $40.9 million. The Creator in seventh place at $36.8 million. My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3 is in 8th place at $28.4 million. Right behind it is Killers of the Flower Moon, which enters the chart in 9th place at $23.2 million. Expendables 4 drops down one spot to number 10 at $16.6 million. And the Indian film Javan drops out of the top 10 altogether. Looking at the 2023 annual box office domestically, there's been no change. There really won't be unless the Taylor Swift movie makes about $40 million more, in which case it'll break into the top 10. Barbie's at number 1, followed by the Super Mario Brothers movie, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and Oppenheimer. The Little Mermaid's in 6th place, followed by Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, John Wick Chapter 4, Sound of Freedom, and Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. There's also no change to the 2023 worldwide box office. Barbie's at number 1 with $1.44 billion. The Super Mario Brothers movie in 2nd place at $1.36 billion. The only $2 billion movies this year. Will there be a third? I'm not so sure. Oppenheimer's in 3rd place at $945.2 million, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 in 4th at $845.5, and Fast X is in 5th place at just over $713 million. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Full River Red, The Wandering Earth 2, The Little Mermaid, and Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1 round out the top 10. Before we go, as always, I like to look at a weekend in box office history, and we are flashing back to the 42nd weekend of the year, back in 1986, October 17th through 19th. The box office was ruled by Crocodile Dundee in its 4th weekend. It dropped 30% for a $7.4 million gross, a total of $42.6 million, and a final domestic unadjusted total of $174.8 million. It is tough to accurately describe the Crocodile Dundee phenomenon here in the United States back in the 80s. I'm just barely old enough to remember it. I was 3 years old when this movie came out. It was a Best Original Screenplay nominee at the Academy Awards. It made Paul Hogan one of the biggest stars in the world for a time. It's like if the Mr. Bean movie had come out here in the United States and made like $400 million and made Rowan Atkinson like the most famous actor in America. That's one of the only ways that I can actually compare the Crocodile Dundee phenomenon here in the 1980s. The 1980s were an interesting time. In 2nd place was another Martin Scorsese film, The Color of Money, starring Paul Newman and Tom Cruise. It would end up winning Paul Newman the Academy Award for Best Actor. It opened to $6.3 million for a final domestic total, eventually, of $52.2 million. Whoopi Goldberg's Jumpin' Jack Flash was in 3rd place in its 2nd week. It had dropped just 28% for a $4.3 million total. Eventually, it would make $29.8 million domestically. Jumpin' Jack Flash was Penny Marshall's first movie as a director, Whoopi Goldberg's 3rd movie, and her first after her breakout performance in Steven Spielberg's The Color Purple. In 4th place is Peggy Sue Got Married, starring Kathleen Turner and Nicolas Cage, in a time travel movie directed by Francis Ford Coppola. $4.2 million in its 2nd weekend, on its way to a domestic total of $41.3 million. And then in 5th place was a movie, quite frankly, I'd never heard of. It's called Tough Guys. It stars Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas. They play 2 old gangsters who are released from prison into the modern world of the 1980s. It did enough to make $2.2 million in its 3rd week for a domestic total of $21.4 million. And to help put all this into even better context, let's look at these numbers when you adjust for inflation. And when we hit that inflation button, we can see that Crocodile Dundee's week 4 total was $20.8 million. To that point, it had made $119.8 million, and its final domestic gross was $490.8 million adjusted for inflation. That's right, a $500 million movie. This movie was massive in the 1980s. The Color of Money's adjusted debut was $17.8 million for a final adjusted domestic total of $146.8 million, so a big hit for Martin Scorsese there. Jumpin' Jack Flash eventually made $83.8 million after a $12 million 2nd weekend. Peggy Sue Got Married was a $100 million grosser adjusted for inflation, $116.2 million after its $11.8 million 2nd weekend. And the movie Tough Guys made $60 million adjusted for inflation. So even though I've never heard of it, a number of people went to see it after its $6.3 million 3rd weekend. And that wraps it up for Charts with Dan this week. I know I haven't done my Coming This Week show here on the channel for the last couple weeks. That's because I have a wedding date that is fast approaching and things are getting complicated as you get closer to getting married. That's how that works. So you haven't seen that show, but I do want to sort of set the table for next week's Charts with Dan episode. Of course, the big release is Five Nights at Freddy's, which is actually a dual release. We're going back to the COVID days. It starts streaming on Peacock Thursday night. It opens in wide release, starting with those Thursday previews. and then going into Friday and the next weekend. And it's actually projected to do quite well when we look at the top 5 openings for video game adaptations as far as movies go. The mark was set earlier this year with the Super Mario Brothers movie at $146.3 million, and that's after opening on a Wednesday. We're not going to be there, but it looks like Five Nights at Freddy's may well be in this top 5. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is in second place at $72.1 million. The first Sonic the Hedgehog movie's at $58 million. Pokemon Detective Pikachu's in fourth place at $54.3 million, and Lara Croft Tomb Raiders in fifth place at $47.7 million. Will Five Nights at Freddy's fall into this top 5? We'll find out next week. Also in limited release, a couple of big awards season contenders. David Fincher's The Killer, starring Michael Fassbender, opens in limited release this weekend before releasing on Netflix in the next couple weeks, and I'll have a review of that movie here on the channel next week. And also Alexander Payne's film The Holdovers, starring Paul Giamatti, opens in limited release before opening in wide release in a couple of weeks, and I look forward to seeing that film. Thanks for spending part of your day here on Charts with Dan. Be sure to stay tuned right here on the channel for more movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.